Hello everyone, my name is Shobham. I welcome you all on behalf of the iVenture at ISP. Today we have with us Ms. Priya Shah, General Partners at Theia Ventures. Priya has a 15 years of working experience across social impact, finance, policy sector in US, UK and Indian markets. Prior to Theia Ventures, she was also a part of the founding team of Yunus Social Business, a global venture tech founded by Nobel laureate Professor Yunus. Prior to ISB, Priya spearheaded strategy, capital raising, and special projects at a Cleantech venture-backed growth startup company. Priya also holds an MBA from Cambridge Church Business School and a BA in History from Brown University. So, on behalf of all of us, I would like to welcome Priya to today's session. Welcome, Priya.
Thank you so much, Shubham. Thank you for the warm welcome, and very excited to be here in the very first episode, and to be interacting with all the startups. So great to be participating here. Today's session is about innovations in climate tech and finance, and I'll start by sharing my screen and then telling you a little bit about myself as well and about UND. So just to get us started. Yes, so essentially, I represent Theia Ventures. We're an early stage, seed stage climate tech fund. We started about 2.5 years ago. We financed about 7 companies now in across different sectors, which I'll go into later on in the presentation. And my background is I spent about 16 years working across impact investing, financial services in the US and the UK. And then in India, I also worked in a clean tech company called Simpa Networks, which was in the off-grid solar space, and worked across various venture funds. So I'm really passionate about climate tech. For me, climate is, sort of cross-cutting across many different sectors, which I'll also go into the presentation. And the need for innovations in climate could never be more pressing than it is today. So I'll start first by talking a little bit about the broader points around climate and how it's sort of the need of the hour. Addressing this issue is really the need of the hour today. So we all know that the world is facing increasing global temperatures. So since 1850, which is about just over 150 years ago, we've had a surge of increase in temperatures. So about 1.2 degrees has been the overall increase in the last few years, in the last few decades, and the consequences of this are quite severe. So an average of about 200 million people are affected every year by natural disasters. Climate change could force more than 100 million people into extreme poverty. It could cause up to 250,000 additional deaths per year between 2030 and 2050. This is all, and then also it could increase the risk of malnutrition and hunger by up to 20% by 2050. So these statistics are all fairly real, and it sort of underscores the point that if temperatures are going to rise more than 1.2 degrees. So if we get to 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or even 2.5 degrees, the consequences could be really disastrous for our natural ecosystems, but also for our man-made ecosystems, for our urban populations, for cities, for access to water, access to clean air, and all of the different sort of services and goods that we enjoy today in our regular sort of modern society. So what, over many different sort of global symposiums and sort of policy convenings and, sort of gatherings of top multinational companies as well as governments, what has been decided globally is that emissions need to be reduced by at least 43% of what they are today by 2030 compared to actually 2019 levels, and at least by 60% by 2035. And this is the decisive decade. So the 2020s are the decade to make this happen. And we are looking at, all countries making commitments to net zero, some by 2030, some by 2050, some by 2070, but essentially net zero electricity generation by 2035 for all developed economies and 2040 for all developing nations like India, for example. And before we kind of go into why this is important and why this is the decisive decade, let's first understand why climate tech is sort of a broad brush of different sectors, which basically essentially tackle the challenge of decarbonization of the whole global economy. So essentially, climate tech is a concept which goes further than clean tech. I think and we'll come to this in the next slide as well. In the previous 2 decades, we talked about we've understood that solar energy, renewable energy, hydropower, etc., and alternatives to electricity generation were essentially the cornerstone of clean tech. But clean tech has now morphed into climate tech, where we actually have a whole bunch of different sectors, the way we live our life, essentially affecting global temperatures and affecting the carbon emissions in the atmosphere. So this goes to show, I mean, not just energy and energy management, but also buildings and built environment, mobility, which is a huge sector. So transitioning from petrol fueled cars to clean electric vehicles and battery powered vehicles, and then heavy industries, so coal and other hard to abate sectors like steel and FMCG, etc. And then also food and land use. So looking at agriculture and ways in which we can mitigate the impacts of carbon going into the soil, as well as more efficient ways of using sort of fertilizers, using fewer chemical pesticides, chemical herbicides, etc., and making sure that we use a lot less land to kind of feed the growing population, and more technological innovations that can help facilitate that, as well as carbon capture, carbon storage, and better carbon management, like measuring carbon management across different industries, and as well as sort of residences and offices, etc. Um, Finally, climate tech is really much more than clean tech, which is what a concept I've already stated. It focuses on broader decarbonization across multiple sectors of the economy. And this is a deliberate pivot, which essentially reflects the complexity and the scale of the climate challenge. So now we're looking at, in this decade, multiple different climate funds, climate sort of divisions within banks, and we'll come to this as well later, how different financing can be actually challenged and channeled towards various different parts of the economy, whether it's startups, whether it's large multinationals, whether it's public companies, and or whether it's even nonprofits. This is a little bit of background on the rise and fall of clean tech as we know it. So essentially, in 2006, that was when clean tech actually had its first resurgence or first sort of growth in Silicon Valley in the US, where you had a whole bunch of startups and renewable energy technologies, which attracted over $1 billion of VC investment. And the reason why sort of these kind of companies became really sort of interesting to VCs is because there were rising fossil fuel prices and growing consumer awareness about clean tech. So a lot more consumers were actually switching to renewable options. This is mainly the electric generation aspect. People were getting solar panels for their homes, for their offices, even for their residential vehicles, etc. And it looked like a very attractive option. However, 5 years or 2 to 5 years later, clean tech was essentially in shambles as a sector, as a venture capital sector, because a lot of public companies actually traded at steep discounts to the market peak. And many of the companies that were funded by VCs in the Valley actually shut down and were on their last legs. So, why did this actually happen? Mainly because one reason of it was because there were actually cheaper, much cheaper solar panels and other sort of products produced in countries like China. So in the US, that actually meant that it was less cost effective to switch to solar. And two, oil prices actually fell, globally in at that particular time span. So it actually led to lower adoption of clean tech products. And another reason, which is not listed here, but which we know anecdotally, is also that venture capital firms back then expected clean tech companies to actually grow and scale as fast as software companies, which is usually, I mean, it's not really as possible because these clean tech companies had a lot of, hardware and, were quite asset heavy, etc. And it was essentially, less easy for these companies to kind of scale up rapidly with such heavy assets on their books, and, trade at much higher valuations compared with the growth of software companies. So the sort of lens at which these venture capital firms looked at at these startups was actually through a software lens rather than a hardware lens. And now what venture capital firms are doing, a decade and a half later, is to actually make allocations for hardware and deep tech type of deals within their portfolio, so that they know that this is going to be a longer time period or longer gestation for actually holding on to these investments and then helping them scale. It might be 7 years, might be 9 years, it might be 10 years, rather than this quick turnaround of 5 years. And so this is one of the other reasons that the clean tech boom actually ended up in a bust, because there was an inaccurate calculation of how long these companies should be invested in by venture capital firms, and we need more patient capital actually in this particular new avatar of clean tech, which is now climate tech, to actually make them survive and scale up and actually make a much larger impact in the future. Um, and one other thing that's actually changed, which is quoted by the World Economic Forum, is that solar and wind, which are the new renewable sources of power, are actually now the cheapest source of new power, and it represents nearly 90% of electricity generation. So, because governments have realized that solar is actually much more, I would say, beneficial in terms of the lack of fumes and the lack of sort of carbon emissions that come from renewable energy. There's actually been a lot more subsidies now put towards solar energy. So even in India, solar energy is cheaper than 4 rupees per kilowatt. So it's much easier now for large Indian sort of power generation facilities to switch and integrate to solar. And this is actually, and even in electric vehicles, for example, this, because of the subsidies in India that have been put on electric vehicle, both on batteries and the actual OEM production, it's actually been cheaper now to convert to electric vehicles rather than sticking with your internal combustion engines, the ICE vehicles, which are essentially petrol powered vehicles. So there's a positive shift now coming in the next couple of years to moving towards much more sustainable forms of sort of existence, essentially, both in industry and in personal usage of these products. Um, Going through climate lexicon, so I'm sure over the next couple of episodes you'll hear a lot about some of these terms. There are three main terms that in public policy and in sort of larger climate discourse that we talk about. One is adaptation. Climate adaptation is essentially a set of actions or processes that help societies to adjust to the changes in climate that are coming our way. So it's basically startups or kind of I would say innovations or sort of changes that governments are making that essentially help us adapt to, let's say, 1.5-degree increase in temperatures or 2-degree increase in temperatures, etc. Climate resilience is a second sort of concept within the climate tech sort of lexicon. And this essentially is a new way of thinking that essentially advocates system-wide changes, new ways of sort of thinking and planning, and enhancing our ability to absorb shocks and recover from the impact. So community building, essentially ecosystem building, ways in which we can become stronger as populations to essentially, take on the climate challenge. And then lastly, mitigation. So mitigation is a very important, that, I would say, one of the elements of deep tech startups, for example, because these are actually innovations within climate that reverse climate change. So basically reduce the flow of heat trapping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and reduce the sources of these gases. So essentially create carbon sinks, create carbon storage, and basically try to take carbon emissions out of the air. So it's a real decarbonization innovation. And this basically, number three, is more of the extremely sort of deep tech startups that have been growing in a lab and then basically looking to scale up and commercialize, but have really taken on the concept of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Whereas adaptation and startups are more startups that help us adapt to the changing sort of climate and changing temperatures that we have. So those are the sort of three main areas within climate tech that you'll see pop up fairly quickly when you're looking at doing your research into this space. Uh, and this is the market opportunity for climate in India. So essentially, when we when we as a fund were thinking about, setting up this sort of thesis for climate, this was in 2021, where the majority of activity around climate tech was mainly around electric vehicles and around renewable infrastructure. So many of these other sectors like alternative materials, water tech, battery chemistry, circular economy, many of them were in early stages, but not yet, hugely commercially viable. Um, but essentially, we were thinking about how to actually map out what the opportunity was in India. So first we looked at what is the availability of natural resources in a country like India. And when you say natural resources, we're talking about, the availability of solar, how much sunlight do we actually get in India? How much can be then utilized for converting into solar energy? What is the accessibility of forests, of water, of agricultural cultivable land? These are all aspects which help us understand what the how this can be, these resources can actually be utilized through technology and through some man-made innovations to essentially help mobilize, new, I would say, startup venture ideas, which can then utilize these natural resources to develop interesting innovations in the private sector. And then we look at the public sector, which is essentially what does policy support and regulation look like. So fortunately for India, the last 2, 3 years, the government has been especially excited about the green growth agenda. This year is actually India's year of leading the G20 delegation. And so the Earth is the sort of policies around the green growth agenda: one earth, one family, one people. This is one of the slogans, and the earth piece is very much encapsulated in the government's commitment to climate action. So there's been a huge number of new departments set up, and exciting data that's been revealed, and exciting commitments that the government has made towards green hydrogen, towards battery swapping, towards sort of reducing the subsidy, or sort of increasing subsidies on electric vehicles, and the sort of switch towards electric vehicles, as well as sort of mangrove support to make sure that we have enough carbon sinks across our coastline, and forest cover, etc., reforestation initiatives. So it's a very positive, policy environment for climate tech. Um, and then we looked at also how large is the demographic. So we all are aware India is a country of 1.3 billion people. So it's the most populous country on earth. It just surpassed China earlier this year. And we have a huge consumer population that is also ready for new innovations within climate, whether it's waste management or whether it's sustainable goods, etc. So we have an addressable market that can actually take on, and we can make a huge shift. So, in global commitments towards climate change. So in India, for example, I mean, if we look at India as a holistic, part of the larger global agenda within climate, there is no climate solution actually globally without the participation of India. So it becomes really important because of India's important role as an economy, one of the largest economies in the world, as well as the largest populous country in the world. We need to be committed to climate change so that the whole world can also move forward in their commitment too. And finally, we have the sort of potential for tech integration, hardware and software. So essentially, India has been home to a huge number of entrepreneurs for the last 10 to 15 years, working, being venture funded, scaling up companies and growing companies, and then harnessing, engineering talent and hardware talent, and, sort of lab scale innovations that then scale up. So there is a huge amount of opportunity here for early stage companies. And then these are some of the key trends. I already touched on this earlier. Electric mobility is being pushed to the forefront by Government of India mandates. So by 2030, majority of all fleets, whether it's Amazon or Swiggy or others, will all be moving towards being electric, essentially. The two-wheeler and three-wheeler movement in cargo and shipment, as well as intercity and hyperlocal delivery, will all be powered by electric vehicles. Um, Unit costs on solar have decreased, as I mentioned. So there is a much larger incentive for buildings to switch to solar for their own usage. Single-use plastic was banned from July 1st of last year, and there are extended producer responsibility guidelines in place so that large sort of factories and institutions that are generating a lot of waste have the sort of mandate now to actually recycle and segregate a lot of that waste so that it can be reused. Um, and then we have, as mentioned before, fast-growing entrepreneurial talent and deep science innovation that is actually becoming a very large feature of the Indian venture ecosystem. And we have an exciting exit environment for high growth companies. So we've seen in the last few years, not in climate yet, but in many other sectors such as financial technology and consumer tech, etc., the possibility of growing to IPO status or mergers and acquisitions. And there are a lot of interest from foreign funds and foreign strategic investors in sort of injecting capital into Indian startups. And so there's actually a lot more motivation for a lot of these entrepreneurs to start companies, especially in a sector like climate tech. And finally, this is just a summary of some of the policy pushes that I've already mentioned that have taken place in India, but we have, renewed commitments to the renewable missions. The government has also set up real-time energy markets, and that has allowed efficient trading between private sector players and public sector players in sort of energy purchase of 1 megawatt, 10 megawatt more amounts of energy that can be used between transmission and power generation. And that could actually help to alleviate the burden on discoms. In addition, open grid access rules also help in electricity demand and electricity management. Green hydrogen policy, this hydrogen has become a buzzword now in India, but there's been a huge push by the government to make sure that hard to abate sectors like steel, coal, etc., they start to think about replacing their chemical burners with green hydrogen, which is the sort of cleanest form of hydrogen. And then there's mangrove initiatives to sort of help with the carbon sinks, energy conservation amendment bill, which was passed last year, which was looking at starting sort of kickstarting the carbon markets within India, EV mandate, which we've already discussed, battery swapping policy, sustainable cities, which is basically helping cities become more energy efficient and making sure that there are sort of rainwater harvesting and renewable energy mandates even within the construction of new cities. And as we mentioned here, One Earth, One Family, One Future as a theme of India's G20 presidency. So these are some of the broad sectors. I'll just go through, I won't go through each and every one of them, but just to sort of, give you an overview of how we look at the climate tech space and what kind of segmentation that we've done. The first sector that we've, sort of done a sort of, I would say, a deep dive in and our own investment thesis is energy distribution and storage. So within that, we have everything around sort of solar, smart metering, energy management for buildings, virtual power plants, which is essentially software innovations and APIs over the actual grid infrastructure that helps different sort of actors within the electricity ecosystem to talk to each other through the software. So we've invested in two companies that are working on this. One is working with we'll go into that in a little bit of detail, but one is working with vehicle to grid, so basically helping EV batteries get charged, basically charge the grid when the grid is actually volatile and facing sort of issues on the supply. And then we've also invested in an energy data management company, which is basically kind of like a microgrid, helping different buildings sort of trade energy with each other through the virtual power plant. Another important sector is alternative materials. So many of the materials that we use today are essentially, I would say, mainly governed by plastic. The sort of essential ingredient to a lot of these is the synthetic hydrocarbons and plastic. So what we are looking at is startups that can actually innovate on sustainable materials as alternatives. So whether they're using agro waste or recycled plastics or any other form of material or green chemistry, innovations that can actually change the properties of the earlier hydrocarbons to actually something but that could be much more biodegradable and can kind of be circular, fit into the economy. So that could really reduce the waste the sort of non-biodegradability of the waste management issue in India, which is also faced by huge amounts of landfills. But also it could help to sort of reuse materials or use materials that would otherwise be wasted, like an agricultural waste. In India, a lot of farmlands actually burn the agricultural waste rather than reusing it for sustainable, these kinds of areas. So packaging, fashion, even construction and other parts of the circular economy. Another area that we're quite excited about is climate smart agri-tech. So I mentioned earlier about looking at agricultural land as a way and looking at technologies that can help us reduce our dependence on land-based farming. And so we look at areas like food waste processing, alternative protein, which is basically reducing the need for animals and the supply chain, hydroponics and vertical farming, where you can actually build farms vertically or indoors that can actually use up much less surface area than going into having with your larger industrial farms. Precision agriculture, using sort of technology like drone technology to sort of assess where with the right kind of weather patterns and the right kind of farming locations and yield would be. And then finally, synthetic biology, which is essentially using different forms of I would say soil innovation and looking at the innovation in microalgae and other sort of areas to basically create products and services that from the land that we wouldn't normally have. Alternative energy is essentially looking at green hydrogen, biofuels, and biomass, mobility and battery tech. So, this is an area that we are getting more familiar with as electric vehicles, sort of start appearing more frequently in all of our urban areas as well. So, charging and swapping infrastructure, battery chemistry, second life batteries, and then EV fleet management. And that climate intelligence is another area that we look at as well, which is essentially looking at geospatial data tracking, waste management, and traceability, and basically using other forms of tracking data. So I think here water tech and carbon capture don't necessarily fit into climate intelligence, but they fit into adaptation, which is sort of one of the climate lexicon areas that I spoke about earlier. And then we also have carbon markets, which I think many of you are also familiar with, carbon credits. So we have different ways in which we look at, the carbon markets, carbon accounting, which is essentially measuring the industrial source of emissions. It's through scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 accounting, and then offset marketplaces for nature-based solutions. So nature-based basically means looking at forests and agriculture and mangroves and oceans, basically to create carbon sinks and to have more efficient ways of farming so that they are not, or at least of preserving these areas so they can actually absorb carbon from the atmosphere. And then also consumer green fintech options as well. And then property tech, which is essentially the built environment. So looking at ways in which buildings can actually help us reduce our dependence on carbon, carbon injection into the sort of electricity supply, into cooling, into energy efficiency, and then also help us create, more efficient, more sort of cleaner indoor air and working environments as well. Um, so looking ahead now, Theia Ventures, as I mentioned, we're a seed stage climate tech fund. We only invest in climate, so we only look at companies that are achieving decarbonization and net zero emission goals. We generally look at companies that are B2B, so we don't look at consumer solutions. This is because we think that the entire transition towards climate tech in India will first happen through industry and business, and then will take place on the consumer side, unlike in the West, where they already have been a little bit ahead of India in the sort of the B2B side. And now consumers are a bit more conscious and able to make choices that will lead to more sustainable sort of adoption and more awareness of sustainable products, essentially, or cleaner products. In India, we're not quite there yet. So we basically look at companies through our fund that only have a B2B sort of impact. And then we also look at companies that are IP led. So essentially have intellectual property or have some kind of technology. They they don't necessarily have to be deep tech, but they have to have some kind of differentiation. And we generally look at hardware companies. We're not so much of a software investor. Um, so we've invested in 7 companies, as I mentioned earlier, across smart grids. So Probus, for example, is a smart metering company. Canvaloop is a sustainable fashion company. So they take the example I was using earlier about agri-waste. So they take waste from hemp plants, rice, linseed, uh, uh, and pineapple and banana, and they essentially use these fibers to basically manufacture through enzyme solutions, which converts the fiber into softer textile grade fiber. But essentially, these are used to make yarn and garments in the in the fashion industry as an alternative to cotton, polyester, acrylic, and nylon. So very interesting company, also B2B. Sheru is a third company that we invested in, which is it was in the battery swapping space, and now, as I mentioned, they're working on making their batteries or aggregating their batteries through the three-wheeler vehicle network and actually plugging them into the grid. So they have relationships with Tata Power and with BSES Yamuna and BSES Rajdhani to essentially, whenever the grid actually goes through a fall in the energy usage, they actually plug in the clean energy source of the batteries that could actually help bring the grid stable again. So they charge grid companies essentially for the usage of these batteries. EdgeGrid is an interesting company, which I also mentioned in the virtual power plant space, working with buildings and helping them regulate their energy data management with discoms as well. Exponent Energy is actually in another EV company in the fast charging space. So they've developed essentially fast charging stations across different cities, starting with Bangalore, which could actually essentially help, and battery technology that could actually work on three-wheeler cargo vehicles that are used for deliveries, but essentially can help these vehicles, charge within 15 minutes. So it's a very effective solution, no need for swapping the battery, etc. And these vehicles can do a much larger uptime now when they're running around the network. Varaha is an interesting company that we invested in, which is in the carbon credit space. They're essentially working on soil carbon solutions, helping farmers in India and other countries essentially transition towards more organic forms of farming, and then helping them get access to these credits, which they then sell through Varaha's network through to buyers of these credits in Europe and the US who are these large companies like Shell and others that can essentially help basically offset their own carbon footprint. So that's what Varaha is doing. And then finally, Metastable Materials is a battery recycling company that essentially takes EV consumer waste and battery waste or electronic waste, and then extracts lithium, nickel, and cobalt, so 3 important elements from these batteries, and then recycles or cleans out these materials, achieves their purest form, and then sells it back to the battery manufacturer. So a very important part of the circular economy value chain. So these are examples of our portfolio. I'm just going to walk through 1 or 2 slides on why, as a broader topic, why we think India could become or needs to become a global climate leader and how. So essentially, collaboration is key between multiple stakeholders. So we, as Theia Ventures, we are actually one of the earliest players in the climate tech ecosystem in India. We have created, or we're part of various different communities around climate, but essentially we're trying to help startups talk to corporates who talk to investors and policymakers as well as universities to actually foster the development of this nascent ecosystem. So along with ISP, we have relationships with other universities, both in India and abroad. And we also have relationships with think tanks, for example, like ORF, which is Observer Research Foundation, which we're publishing a bunch of reports with. We're also part of a founder ecosystem called Sustainability Mafia, of which I'm a director, which is 75 plus climate tech startups, and we're helping them constantly get access to corporates and investors and other international funds. And then we're doing a bunch of other work in the ecosystem to help support. Second thing is that climate technologies are actually closely linked to R&D and hardware, which is a point I mentioned. So it's not purely, a software tech venture play, like what has been the case for most venture capital funds, looking at expanding their footprint, in this space. They have to look at, a much deeper, deep tech climate venture investing lens, and essentially bringing these innovations from lab to commercialization. So a little bit more patience is needed with these long-term innovations that could take a while to actually graduate from being a science experiment or project in a lab to actually something that can be commercialized and where clients can pay for. And then finally, funding for climate needs to take three forms. And this is to the climate financing point that was also part of this original title for this talk, which is what we've actually seen in this, having been in this ecosystem for a while now, is that there are three types of funding. So one is venture equity funding, which you're all familiar with, I'm sure, where you actually, as an entrepreneur, you take equity you take capital essentially from various different funds, and then you as a founder would have to dilute to make space for these investors who would take a portion of shareholding in your cap table. So that's venture equity, and this would be essentially these investors would be in locked into your company for however long they're able to see value in the company, and eventually they would sell out their stake to either a larger strategic investor or help take your company into the larger public market. Number two is essentially debt funding. So this is actually interesting because we have seen, there's actually not that many debt funders in India. There's way more equity funders for startups, but this is a need, and we need to have more NBFCs, so non-banking finance companies, as well as more banks taking an interest in both asset financing as well as other areas of, capex funding as well into debt, and also sort of other types of working capital financing too. So SIDBI has actually started a really interesting facility where it's lending out to EV companies at a much reduced rate. This is in the form of asset financing. There are also plenty of different NBFCs working in this space, which I'm sure you'll also get to know as well. And so that's an important need. And lastly, the other type of funding is through philanthropic capital. So blended finance is essentially the concept of grant funding as well as some kind of combination of equity and debt that might come from multilateral development banks like Asian Development Bank and others, or through philanthropic donors. So these are the types of funding that we see, and these are the key kind of, I would say, tenets to make sure that India becomes, a leader on the global climate stage. In terms of vision for the future, so Al Gore, who is one of the most famous sort of climate activists of the last 2 or 3 decades, and who now runs a fund called Generation Investment Management, which is focused on climate, based in the UK. He said that we're in the early stages of sustainability revolution, so driven in part by machine learning, AI, the Internet of Things, biotechnology, and all of this makes up the potential to completely reshape our world. So we're in a very unique position where, yes, we're faced with a very dangerous, potential future of the world increasing its global temperatures, heat waves, wildfires, natural disasters, etc., which are going to become much more common as global temperatures have been rising and the amount of carbon has been rising in the atmosphere. But we also have a very advanced technology, sort of, I would say, technology sort of economy and population that can actually help to harness some of these skills to help mitigate some of the effects or dangerous effects of climate change. So we're at this point where we really should use the technology that we've built as a sort of larger ecosystem to help address this for the greater good. And that's it from my side. So thank you so much, and happy to take any questions from you, Suresh. Sorry, Shubham.
Thank you very much, Priya, for letting us host you for the first episode of the Cleantech Talks. And I would like to tell you, like, this session was so insightful, starting from the scenario of how the climate and clean tech initiative started and the need for that, and keeping that thing in mind and tracking down to the current scenario in India, how the climate startups are started to grow and how the government agencies and the investment institutions are coming together to host it. And again, the pointers you have mentioned throughout the session, like how startups can keep that in mind when they are going to pitch in front of the investor. So again, thank you very much for the very insightful session. Now I would like to quickly get into the Q&A session. I would like to have this privilege for asking question on behalf of all the startups. So, as you have already covered a lot of pointers throughout the session on how and what sort of pointers or segments startups should look after before going to pitch in front of the investors. But I would like to know if you can give us a quick checkbox of the pointers you as an investor look this startup should be ready before coming to you.
Sure. Yeah, very happy to share that. So we're early stage investors. So for us, we often are, the first check into a company or part of an investor consortium where it's part of the seed round or the pre-seed round. So usually the company has not actually got any funding from anyone before they come to us. So the three things that we would say we look at with a lot of detail, and they're almost equal weightage, when we're analyzing and evaluating an opportunity. One is essentially the founder market fit. So we look at whether the founding team of this company has the adequate skills and experience to essentially address, this large market opportunity that they're looking to address and tap into. And whether they don't have the skills now, but they're looking to actually add those skills during the fundraise or shortly afterwards using the funds that we've deployed, or essentially that they don't know anything about the space, but they're willing to learn and ascertain where their gaps are. Or they come from a science background and they're looking for a business person. So the team is very important as one. The second piece is the market opportunity. So we don't look at sectors that are less than $1 billion in terms of size. So that's why electric vehicles are very exciting for us. Batteries are exciting. Alternative materials are becoming exciting. And we generally want to wait until a sector is large enough for this startup or this whole series of startups with a similar kind of approach to be able to thrive and address, in terms of a commercial revenue opportunity, because eventually we as investors also want to be able to make a good return for ourselves too. So that's the size of the market opportunity. And then the last thing is essentially the product market fit or the technology. So what the founders actually building or thinking of building, it should be very unique. So, for example, we have invested in a company called Metastable, which I mentioned earlier, which is a battery recycling company. So, this company is using an extremely unique process of extracting the lithium and the cobalt and the nickel from the waste, the consumer waste and electronic waste that no one else has actually thought of and used. So they have several patents on this technology and it's highly energy efficient. So they use much lower temperatures than a regular battery recycling company and much lower wastage as well and much lower chemicals. So this actually made us quite excited because we knew that this technology would be different and very difficult to replicate. And that made this company way more valuable than looking at a company that was doing something very similar to what others are doing. So product market fit and technology differentiation are the third piece that we look at as well.
Great, great to know about that. So, coming to my second question is somewhere related to the first one. So, while you were talking about the ways of investment in India, you said like India is very heavy on equity funding, and that I totally agree with. And so, I want to relate this question with this statement: like, if India is really heavy on the equity funding, that means they are looking some sort of expertise from the investment side where they want the investor to be a strategic partner. So I wanted to understand what do you think, what sort of changes the investment agencies can bring on, adapting the climate tech solutions for the startups in India.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. So, no, you're right. So, I think it's a similar, I would say, balance even in the US. There's a lot more equity funds than debt funds and banks, etc., looking at financing this space. And I think one of it is some of the reason why is because of the level of risk that you have to take early on. And equity funds are just willing to take that risk because that's essentially part of their model. So they take risk, they take a company that is sort of not funded yet and they take ownership of say 10%, 15%, 20%, which is a fairly large chunk. And then they help, as you said, as a strategic partner, these equity investors stay invested in the company for say 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, etc. And they help grow the company. So these investors, and I think startups, the right kind of startups who are looking to partner with the right kind of investors. Obviously, you need to do your research as a startup to see who is actually the right fund partner for you. But essentially, you should look for an investor that has really good connections connections in the ecosystem. And when I say connections, it's in your field specifically. So if you're an agri-tech company, you should look at an agri-tech fund that has funded similar companies like yours, or even a portfolio that can be beneficial and have a lot of synergies with your company too. But also, do they have good connects to universities, research labs, deep tech experts, policy, and also have they got really good exits, out of their other companies? Have they been able to bring in a corporate venture capital, or a large multinational, or have they taken any companies to IPO? And these are the kinds of considerations a startup should have before going into a long-term equity sort of relationship. And sometimes it's quite challenging because you end up as a startup pitching to so many people, and then you deal with acceptances, rejections, etc. So you have to be fairly balanced. And but it's important to know who the investors are, and do your research on them before you go and pitch. And my thinking is that yeah, I think there's definitely an improvement, or at least a huge growth in the number of knowledgeable investors in India in the last like, sort of 10 to 15 years, and especially those who are sector specific. So, if specifically in climate, I think it's really important to target a climate fund or someone who is really knowledgeable about your space, because then they can add a huge amount of value, both on the industry connections, but also on various other aspects too, and help you with talent, help you with hiring, help you with product innovation. So these all are part of it, and you should look at evidences of that investor helping other companies too, because then it shows that they're actually involved in the company's overall growth trajectory, and not just a passive investor.
I totally agree with you. I often, tell my startups you should not look into the number of startups ventures have supported in the past. You should look into the type of startups they've supported in the past. If it is related to you, you should look after sort of like how they have supported and how they have grown. So this is something startup they should look after. So coming to my third question, I wanted to ask you in terms of impact measurement. Okay, how does the ventures ensure that the supported projects contribute significantly to climate change mitigation?
Mm, No, that's a great question, and that's something we also take very seriously as well. So, typically in our impact, when we are looking at, I would say, monitoring a portfolio company, we look at sort of, the monthly MIS, which is generally the financials and other sort of business targets that the company reaches. And then usually it's every quarter, every 6 months, we also ask them to submit impact metrics. So essentially, this could be metric tons of carbon dioxide averted, or the amount of waste that they have averted from a landfill, or essentially the emissions that they have, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that they have managed to reduce, and also, in terms of, I would say, social impact too. We have invested in companies that work with farmers at the base of the pyramid. So looking at how these companies have increased, the income the income threshold of sort of per farmer, and also the sort of yield of the farmer on the cultivable land, etc. So we're very active on making sure that the companies report these metrics to us. I would say in general, we are not an impact only fund. So we're more of I would say, a commercial fund with an impact lens as well. But climate, anything that is to do with climate needs to have a carbon impact measurement sort of thesis. So we want to make sure that we create relevant metrics for each company that are usually customized so for a circular economy company, or for an EV company, or for a solar infrastructure company. All the metrics will be slightly customized and different, but they'll all be related to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and how we're planning to ask these companies to reduce those.
Absolutely fair, because this is something I wanted as startups to understand. Also, I wanted to get to know, I wanted to know the vision you as an investment agency are following when you are, creating a investment brand itself, which is like focusing on climate or clean tech solutions. So what sort of vision you are holding when you are trying to, say that we are heavily investing in climate? So is it related to something you're trying to do, a kind of a big impact you are trying to create, or is it just a commercial part of it? But truly said from your end that along with the commercial part, you're also looking into how you can measure the carbon and all. So these kind of things are very important because we should always stick to the original plan where we have started and the vision for our company. So coming to the last question, I want you to share one example of any startup where you thought that it's a game changing startup, and this innovation is something ventures has supported, and it has contributed to mitigate climate challenges. Any startup, not from your portfolio, any startup you have seen so far?
Yeah, sure. So there's plenty of startups, I think, operating in India and abroad. Um, I think one area that we're really excited about is the carbon markets space. So there's several startups that we think are doing really fantastic work because they're working on nature-based solutions, as I mentioned earlier, helping farmers cultivate the land so that they're using much fewer pesticides and chemical sort of inputs into the agriculture. Sorry, but also helping farmers get access to revenue, sort of upfront. So Varaha is one of our portfolio companies that is really game changing, in my opinion, because and there are several companies similar to Varaha that are operating outside India too. So there's one called Bhumitra, which is in the US. There's one called I think it's a rock carbon company. It's called Undo, based in the UK, which is essentially taking carbon from rocks essentially, and then removing that from, and then essentially spraying that um, into agricultural land to have to be absorbed into the soil, and again to sort of absorb carbon from the atmosphere. So we think that these kind of startups have that dual mission, coming back to your impact point, which is the social impact of benefiting the farmers and helping them reach a much larger sort of income in their pocket, but also helping the sort of larger climate agenda by basically taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So essentially, it's climate mitigation in a way, and it's very revolutionary, and using financial mechanisms as well, like forward contracts, etc., to help the carbon credit sort of generation. And so these farmers, even though it's a 5-year sort of measurement period of which how they're going to be measured for reducing the amount of carbon that they're actually using in farming, basically they are then they actually get paid upfront in some portion, and then they get incentivized over the next 5 years to continue farming in that way. So this is a very long-term view to essentially a new form of agriculture, a new form of essentially food security that I think is very sort of game changing for the planet essentially. So I think that is hugely beneficial, and that same concept can be applied to forestry, to ocean carbon, to mangroves, and to various other pieces. And I think it's in my opinion, it's a sector and a bunch of companies that we've observed in this sector that are really doing fantastic work.
Excellent. So this question was for our startups. I wanted you to give an example which can motivate them to, follow their dreams. So if they want to create a difference, they should follow. So with this, we came to the end of our session. I would like to thank Priya for, helping us to conduct so insightful session, talking about the clean tech and climate tech initiatives across the globe and the current trends in India. So once again, thank you very much, Priya, for helping us and letting our participants and startups to know about the current trends in the investment scenario as well. So again, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you for being part of this enriching session. The insights and ideas shared today have undoubtedly fueled our collective efforts to drive innovation in the realm of climate tech and finance. For this, I would like to thank Priya once again on behalf of all the AICISB team and on behalf of all the startups. Priya, we would love to hear a few words from your end to the startups.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you again for having me as well. See, I think that, you're all in a unique position where you've chosen to actually create your own venture. And it's a very exciting journey. I'm sure you'll see ups and downs, but mostly it'll be very exhilarating and fascinating to sort of, take a break from the sort of conventional corporate world and look at, developing your and furthering your own idea and seeing how you can get it funded, attract clients, and essentially grow. So I think it's a really exciting step that you've all taken. I think I would encourage you to think about the ways in which you market yourself to potential investors. Think about how you can strengthen your team, crystallize the ideas around the size of the market opportunity, and how you can make investors comfortable with the type of market you're addressing. And then thirdly, how you can differentiate yourself in terms of product or technology. These are the areas that I would encourage you to double down and think of, and everything else can follow, your financial projections or your team structure or your larger team structure, et cetera, or your geographical growth and expansion. But these three areas I would encourage you to really focus on. And I think if you're in the clean tech or climate tech space, you're in a really exciting, sector, and there'll be a lot of activity and a lot of funds that are interested in what you're doing. So best of luck.
Thank you very much, Priya, for your motivating words. I do believe the startups will definitely grow with the session we have conducted today. So let's carry the inspiration from this session forward and continue working towards a greener, more sustainable world. Together, we can create a positive impact and pave the way for the brighter future for generations to come. Thank you once again, and let's stay connected as we embark on this exciting journey of transformative change. Wishing you all continued success in your endeavors. Stay inspired and stay committed to the making difference. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you.